Center for Politics and Public Policy welcomes you to a public discussion on the making of independent India and V.K. Krishna Menon. May I, to start with, thank all of you for your continued support to the Hindu Center's public events since its inception on January 31st, 2013. The Hindu Center has so far organized 28 events, and it is an honor to welcome everybody to this, the 29th event of ours. We meet at a time when popular conversations in the public domain raise sharp questions on the founding principles of India. The making of independent India was a result of a confluence of several ideas, some of which were at odds with each other. This evening we have with us two erudite public intellectuals, Mr. Jairam Ramesh and Mr. Gopal Krishna Gandhi, to discuss the making of independent India and the role of V.K. Krishna Menon, based on Mr. Jairam Ramesh's latest book, A Checkered Brilliance, The Many Lives of V.K. Krishna Menon. Our two honorable guests today don't need no introduction, but it is only in order that I introduce them to you formally. Mr. Jairam Ramesh, a member of the Rajya Sabha since July 2004, is a former Minister of State for Commerce and Power, Minister of State with independent charge of Environment and Forests, Cabinet Minister of Drinking Water, Sanitation and Rural Development, a columnist, television panelist, and most importantly, a parliamentarian who is also an author of erudition. He has spent, I don't think any parliamentarian has used the archives and access to materials so frequently as Mr. Jairam Ramesh. He's author of several books that have analyzed the interplay of politics and public policy on environment, economic reforms, the formation of a new state, Sino-Indian bilateral policy, and among other books, the latest one on V.K. Krishna Menon. Mr. Jairam Ramesh is also a senior visiting fellow of the Hindu Center for Politics and Public Policy, and we welcome you, sir. Mr. Gopal Krishna Gandhi, former governor, diplomat, and administrator, was appointed to the Indian Administrative Service in 1968. He has held key positions, including as Secretary to the Vice President of India and Secretary to the President of India. He headed India's diplomatic missions in South Africa, Sri Lanka, and Norway. He was Governor of West Bengal from 2004 to 2009. Mr. Gopal Krishna Gandhi is Professor of History and Politics at Ashoka University. He is also a monthly columnist for the Hindustan Times, New Delhi, the Telegraph, Kolkata, and he writes from time to time for the Hindu, Chennai as well. Mr. Gopal Gandhi, welcome. The Hindu Center for Politics and Public Policy, a division of the Hindu Group. The Hindu Center for Politics and Public Policy, a division of the Hindu Group, was inaugurated by the President of India, Pranab Mukherjee, on January 31st, 2013. The aim of the Hindu Center is to promote research, dialogue, and discussion to enable the creation of informed public opinion on key issues facing India in order to safeguard, strengthen, and nourish parliamentary democracy and pluralism, and to contribute to the nation's economic, social, and political betterment. The Hindu Center's public events are deliberative platforms for consultations, roundtables, and public discussions on key issues of national importance. To encourage primary research on social, political, and policy-related matters, the Hindu Center has so far supported 31 public policy scholars who studied themes ranging from parliamentary democracy to poverty alleviation and rural health. The works of the Hindu Center's public policy scholars have gained recognition in academic circles through citations, and some of them have gone on to be published in scholarly journals. The Hindu Center has hosted a long list of distinguished speakers for discerning and supportive audiences in Chennai, Hyderabad, and Bangalore. The Center's commentaries, analytical articles, research topics, and recordings of all our past events can be accessed at thehinducenter.com, www.hinducenter.com, which I'm happy to share with you is also catalogued by the Library of Congress, Washington, D.C. May I now invite Mr. Gopal Krishna Gandhi to initiate the conversation with Mr. Jairam Ramesh on the theme, The Making of Independent India and V.K. Krishna Menon, and to moderate the interactive question-answer session thereafter. Thank you. Mr. Gopal Gandhi.
Friends, we are gathered here today to celebrate the arrival of a monumental book on a formidable personality. The book that we are going to discuss and we are going to ask questions about to the author, Mr. Jairam Ramesh, is the product of what can only be called an excavation. The author has explored, excavated, dug deep into the soils of history, historiography, archives, and conversations with single-minded application to detail and an extraordinary knack for unearthing the most unexpected and the most exciting from what would have ordinarily been regarded as the dull and dry material of a biography. This is a knack, and nothing less than a knack. I am not going to speak about Krishna Menon because the author is going to speak about him and the book is about him. But I'll just say this. The word brilliance occurs in the title of the book, which makes me think of the metaphor of brilliant for a diamond, because that is exactly what Krishna Menon was. There was something adamantine about him. While other gems sparkle, the diamond that Krishna Menon was dazzled. It was strong. It was many-faceted and glinted differently at each facet. And it could also cut very sharp. That was the diamond that Krishna Menon was. To stretch the analogy further, this being the city of diamonds, a city in which I am told Her Majesty the Queen Elizabeth II, when she came to India, didn't wear diamonds in any part of India except when she landed in Chennai. She wore a diamond tiara. Diamonds are also supposed to contain sometimes a flaw, which is also called a dosham. This diamond called Krishna Menon has been said to have contained any number, not one, flaws. What those flaws were, how those flaws appeared to the beholder as flaws, depends on the beholder. So some saw the flaw in that diamond as being communism. Was he a communist? Nobody can really answer that except Krishna Menon, who would have said, I've never been a member of that party. Was that flaw arrogance? Many people who knew him would agree, but many people who knew him would also disagree, because as the book tells us, there was a human side to Krishna Menon which was totally disarming and never more apparent than in the sheer humanity of his political nature, which lay beneath his political role in the famous election in North Bombay in 1962, in which I must confess I was wholly with Acharya Kripalani, wishing dearly for Krishna Menon's resounding defeat. I used to get dismayed because at campaign after campaign, Acharya Kripalani would say, Menon is a communist, vote for me. Menon is a communist, vote for me. And every time this continued on, my heart sank, because I knew that is, apart from being not quite right, not likely to win Kripalani-ji many votes. And when Kripalani-ji did get roundly defeated, and not Menon, what happened? Krishna Menon went and called on Acharya Kripalani. And there's a photograph of the two together. Krishna Menon humble in his victory. Acharya Kripalani, something else in his defeat. And finally, as this book tells us, and with that I conclude, Krishna Menon's departure from the office of Union Defence Minister is one of the most moving transactions in modern Indian history. This book has letters which only Jairam Ramesh could have discovered from very unknown people telling him, no social media then, so they were hard letters, real letters, not in the anonymous, sinister disguise of social media. Hard letters saying, I'm a simple man. I work for my livelihood. During lunch hour, we talk. And I can tell you, sir, we are with you, not with those who have asked for your head. And another letter saying the precise opposite. And to which Krishna Menon replies saying, sir, I have noted what you have said. I have this satisfaction that I have served my country by being in office and by my leaving office. And now the conversation. May I ask you the first question?
Sure.
Or would you like to say something before that?
Well, I think your ending was an apt description of Krishna Menon's life. S. Gopal wrote this magnificent trilogy, a 3-volume biography of Jawaharlal Nehru, which has not been equaled. And he was scathing on Krishna Menon. He was critical of Krishna Menon throughout. But when it came to Krishna Menon's resignation, Gopal writes that he earned new dignity and respectability by the manner in which he conducted himself. Gopal, power corrupts, but loss of power traumatizes. And people are not able, you've been in public life, and I'm sure you've gone through the pangs of not being in office. I've gone through the pangs of not being in office, and I can tell you it's very difficult. It's very difficult to adjust to life without the trappings of power and authority. And Krishna Menon adjusted to that life with extraordinary calm and dignity. And to my mind, that was the greatest single achievement of this wonderful character who lived in controversy, who thrived on controversy, actually, and who actually, as I discovered as I wrote this book, had so many facets to him that it was a revelation. I thought I knew much about Indian political history, but it's only after excavating, a wonderful word that you have used, excavating the archives, that I could discover what an extraordinary personality Krishna Menon was and what an extraordinary time in which he lived.
Jairam, you made it easy for me to ask the first question that I intended to ask, and which is not directly connected with the book, but not unconnected either, which is this. I am not going to ask you the expected question, why did you think of writing on this? Why did you think of writing on Krishna Menon? Why did you think of this subject? I won't ask you that boring question generally asked at book launches or book discussions. But I'll ask you this. This book is about a brilliance that was, and a brilliance that was almost denied by the Congress party after Nehru's death. Has that faded or hidden brilliance of Krishna Menon something to do with your own recent history in the Congress, when you seem to have moved from high office to writing biographies?
No. Well, let me say, Ram Guha introduced me in Bangalore at some function saying that Narendra Modi's great contribution to Indian intellectual life is that he's awakened the scholar in Jairam Ramesh. So, no, I think it's a very important question. Why Krishna Menon? And I want to address that question. Indian biography writing is hagiography. By and large, there have been very few Indian biographers. Gopal certainly is a biographer par excellence. Your own brother, Rajmohan Gandhi, his biographies of Gandhi, Rajaji and Patel are a class apart. And Ram Guha himself, his biography of Warrior Elvin and Mahatma Gandhi. Indian biography in general, barring these 3 or 4 exceptions, has been hagiography. We either vilify or we deify. That's one thing that I wanted to take head on, that we could have a different approach to biography writing. Secondly, Indian biography writing, barring these exceptions, is oral history anchored, is based on recollections of people, interviews of people. Krishna Menon, like Huxer, whose biography I did last year, left behind mountains of primary archival material which were waiting to be excavated. These are all in the public domain. I had no special access to it. And these were papers, notes, letters. They belonged, Nehru, Krishna Menon belonged to the epistolary age. They did not belong to the oral age. They belonged to the written age. So there are written records, and nothing in this book is based on hearsay or based on gossip or based on interviewing somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody. This is all primary archival material, and I think that's the reason why it was not to rehabilitate Krishna Menon, it was not to demonify him for what happened in 1962, but it was to tell a story. I think biographies, generally biographies, I believe, this is my own personal belief, the job of a biographer is to ascertain, it's not to assert. It's not to be judgmental. It's very easy to be retrospectively judgmental about political personalities. And I wanted to show, in cold light, based on the archival evidence, what the story of this man was. Because the story of this man is the story of Indian independence in some ways. It's a story of Indian foreign policy. It's a story of India's military preparedness, which resulted in the debacle in 1962. And it's a story of a relationship of two extraordinary individuals for almost 27 years, from 1935 to 1962. Krishna Menon was Nehru's soulmate. He was his ideological comrade. Nehru would write to him 3 times a week, 4 times a week, on people, on issues, on what was happening in India. And Krishna Menon, for every page that Nehru wrote to him, Krishna Menon would write 4 pages. And there were days in which Krishna Menon would write 3 letters, 4 letters. So, I mean, that's the reason why I wrote. It's nothing to do with rehabilitating him. And many people have said that, in 1962, for example, I've been very upfront and saying, look, this is the record. I've been critical of Nehru also, and I've also been critical of Krishna Menon. I mean, October 20th, 1962, China invades India, and for most of September 1962, our defense minister is in New York, and our prime minister is in Western Europe and Nigeria. And on the 12th of October 1962, 8 days before the Chinese invasion, Nehru goes to Colombo via Madras then, where he makes his famous comment that I've told the Indian army to throw the Chinese out. So I think history we must record. These were people who belonged to a generation who they had magnificent achievements, but they also faltered at critical times. And this is not to criticize or judge people, but to actually see Indian political history as it evolved.
Thank you for that. I think it's worth noting and important to note that you have been critical, objective, not just about Krishna Menon, but about the Congress party as it then was, and how it reacted to the public demand for Krishna Menon's ouster, and how it almost exulted in that. I must ask you here something which has been active in my mind. Why is it that leading congressmen from the South have suffered in the Congress as they have over the decades, be it Rajaji who left the Congress, Kamaraj who left that Congress, joined a new Congress, even Moopanar who left the Congress, formed the Manili Congress, others in Andhra, Sanjeev Reddy, Kerala, EMS, Karnataka, Ramakrishna Hegde. And in recent times, I will not come to very recent times, but relatively recent times, why is it that the Congress does not seem to offer congenial hospitality to its great lieutenants from the South?
I think you're determined to get me into trouble. But let me say that, one of the things that the Krishna Menon's life certainly illustrates is the absolute freedom with which Congress members of Parliament could speak to the Prime Minister. Krishna Menon resigned not because Nehru wanted his resignation. In fact, Nehru was most reluctant. Krishna Menon resigned because of two reasons. One, Indira Gandhi went to the President, Radhakrishnan, and told the President Radhakrishnan that save my father from himself. And please prevail upon your friend, the Prime Minister, to accept Krishna Menon's resignation, which had been in Nehru's pocket for a couple of days. But the second reason why Krishna Menon resigned was a particularly maverick and a particularly troublesome member of Parliament called Mahavir Tyagi, who's known Indian political history for a parliamentary intervention when Nehru got up and said, "Why are we all arguing about Aksai Chin? Not a blade of grass grows there." And Mahavir Tyagi got up and he said, "Mr. Prime Minister, not a blade of hair grows on my head, but that does not make it any less valuable." So this was Mahavir Tyagi, friend of Motilal Nehru, a friend of Jawaharlal Nehru. And Mahavir Tyagi gets up on the 7th of November 1962 in a meeting of the Congress Parliamentary Party and says, "Pradhan Mantri," I'll speak in English because I'm speaking in Chennai, so I won't say the original Hindi. In English, he says that, look, it's either you or Krishna Menon. If Krishna Menon doesn't go, you will have to go. Imagine Mahavir, Congress member of Parliament, telling the Prime Minister. This was a raucous meeting where Hanumantaya, Hare Krishna Mahatab, Basappa, and of course Mahavir Tyagi all called and demanded for Krishna Menon's resignation. Incidentally, Mahavir Tyagi was a man who wrote a long 4-page letter to Jawaharlal Nehru in February 1959 protesting Indira Gandhi's appointment as president of the Congress party, and Nehru patiently replied to him, giving the reasons why Indira Gandhi, a 42-year-old Indira Gandhi, was being appointed as Congress president in an environment where the average age of the Congress was over 60. Of course, that average age is now increased. So I think to answer the question that you started off with, yes, I think in many ways that spirit of openness, that spirit of questioning the leadership in party forums has disappeared in the Congress party. But I think it's disappeared in all political parties. I think the Congress is not alone. I think paradoxically, the only party in which internal discussions take place in a full-blooded manner is the CPM and the CPI. It's only the communist parties which seem to have institutionalized inner party discussions. So much so that Jayaprakash Narayan once said that, when revolution comes to India, comrades would still be having their inner party discussions. This was, this all political parties in India. But it's tragic that the nation's preeminent political party, the oldest political party, which had a long tradition. People have this impression of Nehru being, sort of a remote figure whom everybody listened to. If you look at read the selected works of Jawaharlal Nehru, you will see that all meetings of the Congress Parliamentary Party, he was questioned at every step. And T.T. Krishnamachari's resignation was secured by a Congress member of Parliament getting up in the Congress Parliamentary Party and then subsequently in the Lok Sabha and demanding the resignation of the finance minister. That doesn't happen in the Congress. It certainly doesn't happen in other political parties. I think this reason is the Congress got allergic, has it developed some allergy to leaders from south of the Vindhyas. I think that's a spurious correlation, what they say in economics. It's not causation, but it's a spurious correlation. It so happened that, Rajaji left the Congress party in 59, and you more than anybody else will know the background to that. But in 59, he left the Congress party. He was not thrown out of the Congress party. I would say that he left the Congress party for a simple reason that Nehru once said in Madras airport when he was asked why Rajaji was leaving him. He said, well, we belong to the same church, but he believes in the Old Testament and I believe in the New Testament. So some parting was inevitable. Kamraj, again, the history is very, very complicated, but I don't think that Kamraj was thrown out of the Congress party. I think events happened after 1967, which led to a gradual drift between the prime ministerial wing of the party and the organizational wing of the party, which Kamraj epitomized. Devraj certainly split the party in 1978, but then, for every Devraj there is a Sharad Pawar. So I think the Congress central leadership has been quite even-handed in allowing regional leaders leave the party, not just South India. We allowed Mamata Banerjee to leave in West Bengal. We allowed Sharad Pawar to leave us in Western India. And we allowed Devraj, for example, to leave us in the South. So I think, it's an exaggeration for you to say that the Congress leadership has some particular allergy to leaders from the South. I don't think that's quite right.
I accept your correction, Jairam, and I hope that correction will also manifest itself in the unfolding history of Indian politics and in Congress politics. And I must also say, in corroboration of what you have said, that even those who have moved out of the Congress, and I don't necessarily mean people from the South, leaders from the South, but I have some of them in mind, even when they moved out of the Congress, some people in the Congress continue to show them great regard. And Krishna Menon, as you have so magnificently brought out in this book, something I did not know, that Krishna Menon's assessment of both Rajaji and Kamraj was something else. Though both Rajaji and Kamraj had little to share with Krishna Menon in the kind of Congress politics that Krishna Menon represented. And yet Krishna Menon has been amazingly generous throughout, even after Rajaji had drifted away from the Congress.
Let me say here that in 1953, it is Rajaji who is responsible for Krishna Menon becoming a member of the Rajya Sabha when the vacancy was caused by the death of Gopal Samayangar. It was actually Rajaji who first mooted the idea of getting Krishna Menon as a member of the Rajya Sabha, and Krishna Menon represented Madras in the Rajya Sabha for 4 years. And in 1957, when Krishna Menon contested for the first time from Bombay North, the first man to give a public call for vote for Krishna Menon is Rajaji. Rajaji gives a public call saying that a vote for Krishna Menon is a vote for India, because Krishna Menon was just fresh from his 8-hour marathon oration on Kashmir in the United Nations, and Rajaji was the first man to call for Krishna Menon's election. Of course, in 1962, the first man to call for Krishna Menon's resignation was Rajaji. And Rajaji's statement is very nuanced. He says the country cannot afford the loss of Jawaharlal Nehru, but the defense minister must resign. And it was done without bitterness, and they retained. And when CR dies, Krishna Menon's, and this is very relevant to today's politics, which seems to be your intent to have this discussion on, Krishna Menon's reaction to Rajaji's death was CR legitimized dissent in democracy. And he says Rajagopalachari's greatest contribution to Indian democracy was he legitimized dissent. And that's what Krishna Menon said. Let me say something on South India. Krishna Menon is demigod amongst all Malayalis. I have not yet met a Malayali who doesn't think that Krishna Menon is a god. But Krishna Menon opposed the creation of Kerala. And it's very interesting. In 1956, in 55 and 56, he writes to Nehru, he's bombarding letters to Nehru, saying, do you know what you're doing? You're creating Kerala. Kerala will become a bastion of the communists. It will become a red citadel. Do not do this. And by creating an independent Madras, you are going to create a citadel of separatism and fanaticism. So have a Dakshin Pradesh. In fact, this was the proposal of Krishna Menon. And the bitterest line in that letter was to Nehru, some Malayalis are selling you the idea of creating a separate Kerala. Don't fall into that trap. Now that separate Malayali, some Malayali was one of India's most distinguished historians, who was a member of the States Reorganization Commission, K.M. Panikar. And there's a wonderful photograph of Rajaji, flanked by Panikkar and Krishna Menon, the two great leaders. Thanks to Gopal, I was able to locate that photograph. And let me also say, Gopal, that it used to be said in the early 50s that the Indian government, if Nehru suffered from anything, he suffered from meningitis. Because, you see, you had VP Menon advising Sardar Patel in North Block. You had Krishna Menon advising Nehru on foreign policy. You had KPS Menon, being the number 2 man in the foreign ministry. Then you had TG Sanjeeva Pillai, who was a Menon of sorts, who was running the DIB. Then you had Panikkar. And then you had a whole host of N.R. Raghavan Pillai, who was, external affairs. So actually, that whole environment in the late 40s, early 50s, was the age of dominance of the Menons, so to speak. But Krishna Menon stood out because he was the only Menon of them all who was actually a leftist. All the other Menons were basically either centrists or were people who were aligned with Sardar Patel. Krishna Menon was the only one who was actually aligned firmly and squarely with the left and with Jawaharlal Nehru.
I think one must also add in the list of the Menons and Menon-like figures from Kerala who were around Nehru, the great name of K. Shankar Pillai, the cartoonist, who, though not in the official architecture of India, was so integral to the democratic spirit of India, and who made it possible for us to laugh at our leaders. Laughter has disappeared from political discourse in India today. We laugh at others, we don't laugh with others, and we have stopped laughing at ourselves. That is a great,
Gopal,
great loss.
I did a statistical count of Shankar's cartoons from 1950 to 1964. The maximum cartoons every week were on Nehru. The second most lampooned figure was Krishna Menon. Some of the cartoons are reproduced in the book. They were vicious. They were absolutely pungent cartoons. Can you imagine a cartoonist today doing the same thing about the people in power? They'll be behind bars. But in the 50s, you had a cartoonist who was targeting the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister told Shankar, the famous thing, he said, "Don't spare me." And Krishna Menon also, week in and week out, Krishna Menon would be lampooned in Shankar's Weekly, but this was all part of the democratic discourse.
I must also say here, one of the nuggets in this book, with which in fact the book almost concludes, is another facet of the civility of democratic relations and political equations at that time. When Menon dies, Janasangh paper called Motherland has a very moving obituary on Krishna Menon, in which it says some people hold him responsible for 1962, but he was a tough defense minister. And then it ends with a line which is so moving, for it is so simple and so true. The line is, if I remember it right, it says, "And all said and done, he was a clean man." And this has come from the Janasangh. I really long for the time when
in fact
political
the
parties
best tributes to Nehru, to Krishna Menon, were in Motherland and Organizer. Not so much in the Times of India or the Indian Express. Of course, Hindu had a very, very long editorial and tribute to him because he had written for the Hindu in the 30s from London. But it's interesting that it was RSS publications, and the RSS, as you know, had no love lost for Krishna Menon, called him communist and called him all sorts of names. Gopal, one thing I discovered while writing this book is the extraordinary relationship that Mr. Vajpayee had with Krishna Menon. And this was a complete revelation to me. Vajpayee's closest friend, confidant, was a man called Ghatate, N.M. Ghatate, who was a lawyer. Some of you might know him. Mr. Swaminathan will certainly know him, Vice Chairman of the Law Commission. And Ghatate was Krishna Menon's junior for 7 years, from 67 to 74 in the Supreme Court. And Ghatate is still alive, and I spent long hours with him. And very interesting, You see, from 57 to 62, let me just rewind. Krishna Menon is the only Indian political leader in the 50s calling for a negotiated settlement with China on the border. He is the only politician. Even Nehru is not so vocal. Nehru supports Krishna Menon. But Krishna Menon is the only man who was saying, let's do a deal. He was an early Trump, actually. He's using the language of Trump. Trump says, well, let's do a deal. Krishna Menon was saying, let's do a deal. Let's recognize Chinese sovereignty on the Aksai Chin and let China recognize the sovereignty in the Chumbi Valley. And he was talking of a swap, he was talking of a lease, he was talking of a deal. He was criticized. He was criticized in parliament, he was criticized in the media, and most importantly, Nehru's own cabinet colleagues were not with him. Govind Vallabh Pant was not with him, Morarji Desai was not with him, Sardar Swaran Singh was not with him, S.K. Patil was not with him. And Nehru saw the writing on the wall and he sided, with the quote-unquote right wing in his cabinet. Vajpayee was critical of Krishna Menon in parliament, saying, what is your defense minister calling for a negotiated settlement with China? China is occupying Indian territory, they must go. I think the best tribute to Krishna Menon came from Mr. Vajpayee when he went to Beijing in 2003 and there was an agreement signed between the two prime ministers that they will appoint special representatives to have a negotiated settlement on the border. And for the last 16 years, these negotiations have been going on. This is exactly what Krishna Menon had argued. And if you see the back cover of this book, there is a small little snippet from Indira Gandhi, what Indira Gandhi said in Parliament on his death. He said, if Krishna Menon had been listened to on China, our history would have been different. And that, I think, is, in today's politics, Krishna Menon was a hawk when it came to Pakistan. But when it came to China, he believed that we should negotiate the border. But he had ideological differences as far as Pakistan is concerned.
There is a lovely quote in the book. Krishna Menon in United Nations, Firoz Khan Noon, the Prime Minister or the Foreign Minister of Pakistan, is saying, plebiscite for Kashmir. Krishna Menon gets up and says, plebiscite. Mr. Chairman, will you tell Mr. Noon, has Pakistan ever seen a ballot box? Now, just want to move to Krishna Menon, the man. There is one exception, Jairam, to what you said about not a single Malayali has any different opinion on Krishna Menon. Everybody in Kerala thinks he is a god. There's one exception. There may be many, but I know of one. K.R. Narayanan tells me that when he has said this, and many people say this in a speech, that when he was a student in the London School of Economics, this is before independence, and he was still working for the India League, and Krishna Menon was the India League. Narayanan gets a first division, and Narayanan says, the Kerala people in London organized a party for me to felicitate me on getting a first, and Krishna Menon was invited. Krishna Menon came, stood at the door, leaning on his walking stick, and said, so, Narayanan, you have got a first. Some people get it by a fluke. Narayanan, not to be outdone, said, is that so, sir? Is that how you got your first? Krishna Menon's foibles have also been discussed in this book, though not this particular incident. And they include many, many things, from arrogance to juniors, to superciliousness to colleagues.
Let me say one thing on the current situation. Everybody suddenly in India has discovered the preamble to our constitution. Everybody is now reading the preamble to our constitution. The preamble was Krishna Menon's contribution to the constitution. The word sovereign independent republic or sovereign democratic republic comes from Krishna Menon's notes. Krishna Menon was a member of a committee of experts that was set up in July of 1946 to advise the Congress Party on the Constitution before the Constituent Assembly comes into being in December of 46. And this had Alladi Krishnaswamy Iyer, it had K.M. Munshi, it had Krishna Menon by virtue of his proximity to Nehru. And the initial drafts of the resolution that was adopted by the Congress Party, by the Constituent Assembly, put forward by the Congress Party, were drafted largely by K.M. Munshi and Krishna Menon, and those drafts survived in his archives, which I have reproduced. The idea of a Constituent Assembly, Gopal, is a very important idea. We all today swear by the Constitution, but let us understand how the Constituent Assembly came about. The idea of a Constituent Assembly was in the air from the early 1930s onwards. Harold Lasky was amongst the earliest to call for the Constituent Assembly. Krishna Menon was amongst the first to catch on, and he continuously bombarded Nehru on the need to convene a Constituent Assembly. But the Constituent Assembly idea was never accepted by Mahatma Gandhi initially. It took some time for Gandhiji to accept the idea of a Constituent Assembly. Of course, once Gandhi accepts the idea, then the Congress Party adopts it as part of its platform, and the Constituent Assembly comes into being in 1946. So there are these, we look at Krishna Menon only from the lens of 1962, but there is more to this man before 1947, and there is more to this man in the 50s. You know, Kissinger is lauded, Pakistan is lauded for the rapprochement between China and the United States in 1971. You may remember that's when Kissinger flew from Islamabad to Beijing, to Shanghai and Beijing, and that's how the normalization between the two countries started. In 1955, Krishna Menon was doing exactly this. He went to Beijing, he went to Peking, then 10 days, secured the release of 4 imprisoned American airmen, goes to the White House, meets Eisenhower twice, meets John Foster Dulles 6 times. Of course, he also was responsible. He met him 6 times, but somewhere he said, well, you know, somebody asked him, what do you think of the US Secretary of State? And he said, dull, duller, dulles. You know, I mean, Krishna Menon couldn't control himself. But in 55, India almost achieved the impossible, which Pakistan and Kissinger achieved in 1971, which is this rapprochement between the US and China. So there is more to this man than 1962. Today he is seen only through the lens of 1962. But, you know, as Mr. Huxer once said, and I've quoted Mr. Huxer, who was very close to Mr. Krishna Menon in his tribute, all of us Indians have been taught to believe that the Indian freedom movement was part of a revolutionary upheaval in India led by Mahatma Gandhi. That is certainly true. But along with the revolutionary upheaval in India, there was negotiations going on between the Congress Party and the Labour Party for the eventual granting of independence. And these negotiations lasted almost for 12 to 13 years. So on the one hand, we had domestic upheaval, domestic freedom movement, but we also had this negotiations going on between the Labour Party and the Congress Party. And basically, it was negotiations between Nehru and Stafford Cripps, Nehru and Attlee, Nehru and Lasky. And in that, Krishna Menon is a central figure because he is very much part of the Labour Party. So in the pre-1947 Krishna Menon, I think, a very, very significant figure. And Madras plays a very important role in his life. And I want to say this because I'm speaking in Chennai. He was discovered in Adyar. He was discovered in the campus of the Theosophical Society. And there is a beautiful phrase in the book which is attributed, which I have attributed, of course, to Gopal. Annie Besant discovered 2 Krishnas. She discovered Krishna Menon and she discovered Jiddu Krishnamurti. Unfortunately, both Krishnas left her. Jiddu Krishnamurti abandoned her in 1929. Krishna Menon abandoned her in 1930. But Annie Besant, again a figure who is completely forgotten today, plays a central role in the discovery of Krishna Menon. And Krishna Menon goes to England in 1924, escorted by George Arundel. And he becomes a teacher, joins LSE, largely because of the initial financial support provided by Annie Besant and George Arundel. And subsequently, of course, he becomes very close to George Arundel, Rukmini Devi, and his own cousin, Shankar Menon, is a very central figure in the building up of Kalakshetra. So he had Madras plays a very important role in Krishna Menon's life. He studied in Presidency College, and for 3 years he taught at the National University in Adyar, was in the Theosophical Society. So in the pre-UK period, Madras plays a very important role in his life.
And in here, I would like to refer to another Madras and Krishna Menon link. When Krishna Menon was down and out, ceased to be defense minister, and the country had hailed all those who had wanted him out, except for a few who knew better. Madras hosted Krishna Menon that December, 23rd December 1962. Tens of thousands of people were present at Madras's Marina Beach, listening to speeches, the highlight of which was a poem recited by Kannadasan in Tamil, the English translation of which, Jairam Ramesh tells me, has been attempted by Professor A.R. Venkatachalapati, though he himself would say the Tamil is unbeatable, somewhere else. I'll just read out 3 or 4 lines. This is Kannadasan on Krishna Menon in the December of 1962 on the Marina Beach. The gold of India, come. Nehru's comrade, come. You with the honest heart, come. Mountain of justice, come. Now, I want to say here, what Jairam said about the preamble is absolutely true. St. Stephen's College, where some of us invited Krishna Menon around the same time, only St. Stephen's College would do something like that. Krishna Menon comes and he speaks on the preamble. He speaks on the Constitution. And I still remember that small room, reading room it was called, post dinner. Krishna Menon gesticulates. He gesticulates with the finesse of a Kathakali artist. He says, preamble, I will not try to speak like he did, but gestures were this. The preamble of the Constitution of India. It has what you would expect all preambles to have. Equality, liberty, fraternity. But in India, before equality, fraternity, before liberty, equality and fraternity comes justice. I can never forget that. And today, as you quite rightly said, and the preamble has become so valuably cited, we really have to think of Krishna Menon. And curiously, how politics, how life itself is so full of ironies. Krishna Menon and Kripalani, adversaries. Can never forget something that Kripalani said about the Constitution. Again, so relevant today. Somebody told Kripalani in Chennai, again, coincidentally, Dada, you are walking so strong. You have a strong constitution. So he said, what constitution? Only amendments left. So today, when the Constitution of India is likely to be amended beyond recognition, we have to remember both Krishna Menon and Kripalani. Renaissance men from 2 different parts of Indian polity, adversaries, and yet today on the same page of democratic dissent.
No, actually, this dissent is very important, Gopal. He becomes a minister, becomes defense minister. The entire Congress party is against him. He has never been to jail. He's not a Gandhian. Doesn't wear khadi. He wears, Savile Row suits. He's known as Mephistopheles in a Savile Row suit, and the only concession he makes is Mundus and his walking stick. I must tell you a story of the walking stick a little later. Very interesting story about him and Rajaji. He's not been to jail. He's not gone on fast. He's not gone on hunger strike. He has not been lathi charged. But he becomes a member of parliament. He becomes so close to Nehru. He becomes defense minister. So there's always this suspicion. People viewed him with a lot of suspicion. But they were ideological differences. But personally, for example, there's a photograph in the book. I couldn't reproduce the Kriplani photograph because it was very grainy, but there's a wonderful photograph of him and S.K. Patil. S.K. Patil loses the 1967 election. Krishna Menon loses the 1967 election. Krishna Menon fights the 1969 by-election from Midnapur, and S.K. Patil fights the by-election from Banaskantha, and both win. And both come for the meet Parliament, and they meet in Central Hall. And the journalists ask them, well, Mr. Menon, what do you think of the future of India? And Mr. Menon says, I don't worry about the future of India. An India that can vote, elect S.K. Patil from Banaskantha, and at the same time elect V.K. Krishna Menon from Midnapur, its future is safe. And but they were ideologically poles apart. They were at loggerheads on every issue. But they had this, politics was not toxic. They were, and I have said this before, I don't mind repeating it because it's got contemporary relevance. Nehru had critics. Nehru had opponents. Nehru had rivals. Nehru did not have enemies. Because I think his style was such that he didn't create enemies. He had rivals. He had political adversaries. But none of them saw them as enemies. And I think Krishna Menon, even though ideologically was so different from various people, the dissent, the freedom with which he was criticized in the party, in the media, outside, it was duck of a water off a duck's back. Let me tell you a story about this walking sticks. D.R. Mankekar, a famous journalist, wrote a book on India's debacle in 1962, and it's called The Guilty Men of 1962. And the cover has a rose, no prizes for guessing what that rose symbolizes. There's a sword, no ministry who that sword symbolizes, General P.M. Call, and there's a walking stick. Obviously, that walking stick is supposed to represent Krishna Menon. So somebody asked Krishna Menon, Ghatate in fact, asked Krishna Menon, Sir, he was working with Krishna Menon, said, Sir, Mankekar has produced this book and he's got this walking stick on the cover, the rose on the cover, the sword on the cover. I think the rose represents Nehru, the sword represents the army, and the walking stick represents you. He said, that's not my walking stick. That's Rajaji's walking stick. So Ghatate said, what do you mean that's Rajaji's walking stick? Don't you see, there's a rubber ball at the end. My walking sticks all have rubber balls at the end. This one doesn't have a rubber ball at the end. So, I mean, these were the type, those are the types of the political discourse that took place. Politics was intense. Political competition was intense. In 1967, the Congress hegemony breaks. Krishna Menon leaves the Congress party. He doesn't get a ticket. He has won in 57. He has won in 62. He doesn't get a ticket. He goes to Bengal. The communists elect him in Bengal. In 71, he doesn't get a ticket, even though Indira Gandhi is the prime minister and his friend, his confidant of 30 years, Haksar, is Indira Gandhi's alter ego. They keep him at a political distance. The communists help him to get elected from Trivandrum then, and I must tell you, he represented the same seat that Shashi Tharoor is representing now. The only difference is that Shashi Tharoor can speak Malayalam. Krishna Menon spoke no word of Malayalam. He campaigned in English. His campaign material was all in English, translated into Malayalam. But he won. And Gopal, you started off by saying that people thought he was a communist. Actually, he was not a communist. He was asked Are you a communist? He said, why? Because, the communists helped you to get elected in 69 and 71. Don't you love the communists? He says, no, I can't help it if they love me. I don't love them.
I think if Krishna Menon had been around, the Congress and the left in Kerala would not have been fighting each other. They would have been fighting something else together. Now, I just want to say one thing about dissent. There is the polarity between loyalty and dissent. But there is something else in between. For people who are not hidebound loyalists or dissenters by congenital chemistry, some in between situation also. For those people, now the full-time preoccupation is to prove one's patriotism to the right and one's dissent to the left. That middle ground has just disappeared. And that middle ground has been recently resurrected in this way. You mentioned Shashi Tharoor. Jairam and Shashi are two people in the Congress who have dared to appreciate some good work done by the NDA government for the Congress to pounce on them and say, how do you do this? How dare you do this? For a congressman to be able to appreciate such good as the government may do, and for the NDA to say something like shabash to a congressman or to an opponent or a dissenter, that is the retrieval that is necessary, and that is exactly what a state and a city like Chennai, with its great diversities of political views, can bring about.
Actually, in our democracy, or in any democracy, particularly of the parliamentary variety, the opposition is reluctant to acknowledge that there has been some change, and the government is reluctant to acknowledge that there is continuity. I think both are at fault. I think the government must have the courage to acknowledge that there is continuity, and the opposition must have the large-heartedness to acknowledge that there has been change. It's only then that democratic discourse can take place. Otherwise, we go from one end of the spectrum to the other end of the spectrum. You don't have democratic debate. You don't have democratic discourse. You have abuse. You have the type of toxic atmosphere that you have today. But I think the important thing is really, Gopal, without getting into today's political issues, the important thing is that how should we approach historical figures? How do we approach the writing of our recent political history? I think it's very important for us to recognize, that there are multiple strands in our political discourse, multiple strands in our political thinking, but India was a great democratic experiment. And Krishna Menon kept saying, and as did many others also recognized, that we were socialist, but we were socialist in a democratic framework. I think that's very important to underscore, that both Nehru and he were democratic socialists. They were unrepentant democratic socialists. In fact, the 1963 Congress session, and in the 1964 Congress session, in fact, the 1964 Congress session in Bhubaneswar is the last session that Nehru actually goes. And the resolution there was a resolution on democratic socialism. And the man who actually was responsible for getting that resolution was Kamraj. Kamraj was very keen that the Congress party pass his resolution, and the star speaker on that resolution was Krishna Menon. And he expounds on this, that India must remain a socialist state, but it must remain a socialist state in a democratic folding, in a democratic framework. So democratic socialism, I think, was something that Nehru and Krishna Menon were deeply, deeply wedded to.
Now, Jairam, if you agree, we'll open the conversation to the House. Just one observation before we do that, and which is this: since you spoke of socialism and Marxism,
one final comment I want to make on this book. Krishna Menon came from a family of very strong sisters, And very often in the writing of biographies, we tend to overlook, of brilliant brothers, we tend to overlook brilliant sisters. You know, Virginia Woolf had this famous book called Shakespeare's Sisters. She said, we think that Shakespeare is great, but have we ever heard of Shakespeare's sisters? There's a scholar at CDS in Trivandrum called J. Devika, who first alerted me to this possibility that in Kerala's history, I mean, Kerala is a matrilineal society. It's a society which has the greatest gender empowerment. But do you hear of great women of Kerala? You only hear of the great men of Kerala. And in Krishna Menon's life, actually, two very important figures in his life were two remarkable sisters of his. One sister, Janki Amma, with whom he was very close, his emotional sort of ballast, so to speak, with whom he corresponded till her death in 1963. Some of those letters are there. But more importantly, a particularly eccentric oldest sister called Chinnammalu Amma, who was proficient in 6 or 7 different languages, wrote as early in the 1910s in journals brought out by Margaret Cousins on behalf of the Theosophical Society on Indian women, traditional Indian women, and what should be done to reform the Tarawad system. And in 1948, she writes an article in praise of Sheikh Abdullah. In 1948, saying that Sheikh Abdullah is critical to the future of Indian secularism, critical to the future of Kashmir, and it was a very great piece, one of the early pieces that appears in a magazine called Swatantra that was published from this city, which I was able to locate in 1948. So there were some remarkable women in his life, and we tend in our biographies of great men, we tend to overlook the families, and I think Krishna Menon's family had some other equally gifted people who I hope somebody will write life histories of at some stage.
I must also say that the women in Krishna Menon's life are not confined to his sisters. The book has many other passages which are worth reading also. Now, questions from the audience directed to the author of the book.
Mohan Menon. The question is, I'm Mohan Menon. The question is, did he ever take part in Spanish Civil War? Krishna Menon.
Well,
I was told that
we didn't have time to get into it, but I have a whole chapter on the Spanish Civil War. See, one of the defining characteristics of Nehru in the Indian freedom movement was, although he was Gandhi's political heir and dependent heavily on Gandhi, unlike Gandhi, Nehru saw India's freedom struggle as part of a global struggle against imperialism. Gandhi didn't have too much time for that. He didn't have too much time for what's happening in Spain, what's happening in Abyssinia, what's happening in China with the Japanese invasion. Gandhi was more domestic focus, social reform focus. But it was Nehru, and to an extent Bose as well. But Krishna Menon was central to this. And the India League, which fought for Indian independence in England, was actually a league that began to fight for Spain, began to fight for Japan, began to fight for Abyssinia, began to fight for the freedom of the West Indies. So it became a larger forum on anti-imperialist struggles. And the Congress Party raises money from the industrialists of Bombay to send medical supplies to the Republicans in Spain. The Congress Party raises money to send medical supplies to the Chinese who are fighting a war against Japan. There is a letter from Mao Zedong to Krishna Menon in this book. A remarkable letter from Mao, from Chairman Mao, thanking Krishna Menon for all that he has done to get the Congress Party to support the Chinese. This letter, by the way, is 1938. The Spain, the defining issue of global politics in the 1930s was Spain. We tend to forget this, but this was the issue that dominated European politics, it dominated world politics. And Nehru and Krishna Menon went to Spain. They spent 4 days in Spain, and they saw India's freedom movement as a larger part of this global struggle against imperialism. So I think Spain plays a very important role in the India League. It plays certainly a very important role in the Congress Party's internal debates. In fact, one of the issues why Nehru and Bose drift apart. Bose's political philosophy is Chanakyan. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Germany is the enemy of England. England is my enemy. Therefore, Germany is my enemy. And same thing with Japan. But Nehru and Krishna Menon saw things differently. And Gandhi and Rajaji also saw things differently. They saw this, that Britain was fighting for democracy and Britain was fighting for values that weren't necessarily upheld by the Germans or the Japanese. And in fact, there was a proposal that mooted by Krishna Menon for India to offer refuge. Today we are talking of Citizenship Amendment Act. So there was talk in 1938 and 1939 that India should be liberal in giving asylum to those who are fleeing Germany and Italy. There were not many takers for that, and this was opposed by Bose anyway. So it didn't really take off in 1938 and 39. And after 39, when World War II was announced, the entire freedom movement went off on a different direction. So Spain plays a very important role in the lives of both Krishna Menon as well as Menon, and it's also the first public speech made by Indira Nehru in 1936 is on Spain. And the first demonstration in which Feroz Gandhi and Krishna Menon take part is a demonstration on Spain. And you will see in the book a photograph of 1936, Feroz Gandhi and Krishna Menon demonstrating near Hyde Park against British support for the royal force, the forces of Franco.
Sir, as you said, any talk on the Krishna Menon cannot but turn to 1962 war. I got 3 questions on this. One, what was the real reason behind China attacking India, apart from whatever the border problem and all that? Secondly, what was the role of Soviet Union before and during the war? Thirdly, what was the impact of the 1962 war on the Indian economy? People say India before 1962 from 1947 and India after 1962. They say that but for the 1962 war, India would have grown much more than what.
Well, I think the story of 62 is very, very complicated. And I have a whole chapter, on the 62, because that's central to understanding Indian political history. The 62 war, there is a K. Subramaniam, who is India's leading defense expert and father of the current Foreign Minister of India, Jaishankar. I was able to unearth something that Subramaniam had said to Madhavan Kutti, who was a journalist who wrote an early biography of Krishna Menon, where Subramaniam said that the military leadership has transferred all responsibility of the debacle of 1962 to the political leadership, whereas 62 was fundamentally a failure of military command at the operational and field levels. And it's true, the first books that came out of the 1962 war were all by army officers, and that influenced our approach. First it was Brigadier Dalvi's Himalayan blunder, then we had Neville Maxwell, India-China war, which had a profound influence on how the world looked at India in relation to 1962. In fact, Neville Maxwell's book is called India's China War, whereas the evidence clearly shows that the subsequent scholarship shows that 1962 was not India's China War, but Mao's India War. It was a decision taken by Mao for internal political reasons to carry out this. 5 months before the Chinese attack us, General Timaya who is a very central figure in the Krishna Menon story, Timaya writes an article in a magazine called Seminar saying that war with China is unthinkable, that we should not go to war with China. The only way we can solve our problems with China is through diplomatic and political initiatives. I mean, this is Timaya writing in July 1962, 5 months before the invasion. Now, and so, Krishna Menon in 1960, Chow Enlai comes to India. Krishna Menon is kept out of the negotiations. Swaran Singh becomes the chief aide of Nehru during the negotiations because Govind Vallabh Pant did not want to see Krishna Menon as part of the team, because Krishna Menon was actually advocating this negotiated settlement, the swap, lease idea. He's kept out of the negotiations. Srinath Raghavan has written that 1960 was the last missed opportunity for solving the border problem. In 1962, in July, Krishna Menon goes to Geneva and meets the Chinese defense minister, Marshal Chen Yi, and I was able to get from the Chinese archives, thanks to Anantakrishnan, who is the Hindu correspondent, then the Hindu correspondent in the Beijing. He was able to get for me the original Chinese record of Chinese meeting with Krishna Menon in July of 1962 in Geneva, where they talked about continuing talks. So as late as July 1962, Krishna Menon believed that the border could be negotiated, talks could go on. But I think by September, October, it was becoming clear that Mao had different designs. And then a series of disastrous decisions, including sending General Kaul as the head of the army, the operational commander in Nefa, which really I think was a big blunder. And for which India had to pay a very heavy price, and Nehru had to pay a heavy price, and Krishna Menon had to pay a very heavy price. So, this argument that 62, Krishna Menon is the villain of 62 is a very simplistic argument. There are very, very large complicating factors, and I think it has to be read as part of a continuing history. But it is certainly true that Krishna Menon was arguing for a negotiated settlement with the Chinese. He was arguing for it in 1960. He was ignored. He was arguing for it in 1962. Nehru was instinctively supporting Krishna Menon, but Nehru had no support for it in the cabinet. Nehru had no support for it in parliament. Nehru had no support for it in the media.
This is to...
The role of the Soviet Union was particularly nefarious. And in fact, that worked to Krishna Menon's disadvantage. And the argument of Acharya Kripalani was, even the Soviets, whom Krishna Menon loves, have not supported us. And it is true that the initial reaction of the Soviet Union was that, we appealed to our Chinese brothers and our Indian friends. So they were, walking on both legs. So the initial reaction of the Russians was very ambivalent. Remember that when the Chinese invasion of India was taking place, at the same time the Cuban Missile Crisis was erupting. So for the Soviets, Cuba was a bigger issue than India. They were more fixated on Cuba. So I think the Soviet reaction was very, very ambivalent, and that added to India's discomfiture. But the Soviets made amends for it a little later. But let me say something on the Soviet Union, which is very important. Mr. Narendra Modi talks about Make in India. It's a very good policy, Make in India. The first man to implement this policy was Krishna Menon. In 1960, India wanted to buy fighter aircraft. The Americans were offering us Lockheed aircraft. The British were offering us, Hurricane aircraft. Krishna Menon said, I will choose that aircraft from that country which allows it to be manufactured in India. So India in 1962 signed the agreement to manufacture MiG aircraft, MiG-21, first aircraft to be manufactured in India. Subsequently, HAL has manufactured 4,000 aircraft. And the first aircraft to be manufactured in India was the MiG-21 aircraft. And Krishna Menon said, look, we must make this in India. We must not buy the aircraft. The Americans were not willing, the British were not willing, but the Russians were willing. So the Russian role is a bit ambivalent, you know. They didn't support us full throat on China, but they certainly helped us to indigenize our defense production industry, thanks to Krishna Menon.
I think there's a problem in your reading of 1962, just based on what you said. On the one hand, the Congress leadership did not heed Krishna Menon's wise advocacy of a negotiated settlement. What Chou En-lai said, we can, a policy of give and take, a problem left over by history and all that. So there is clear evidence that the dominant leadership of the Congress party in the government did not support that, did not work for it. On the other hand, you say it's the Chinese who pushed, contrary to Neville Maxwell's thesis of India's China war, that is a forward policy going behind the Chinese lines and so on. There's a lot of evidence on that. So there seems to be a real problem, a contradiction in your reading of this. You have to make up your mind, what was it? You can't simplistically say it's the Chinese who wanted the war, while arguing that India, the dominant leadership of the Congress party, did not want to heed Krishna Menon's wise suggestion for a negotiated settlement based on give and take.
Well,
by the way, just unrelated to this, there's another very fine biography, Paul Brass's 3-volume biography of Charan Singh, which is excellent.
Paul Brass's biography is also archival. Now, let me say that it's not just the Congress leadership, Mr. Ram. Even the socialists in Parliament, all the socialists in Parliament were against a negotiated settlement. The Jansangh and the Swatantra were, in fact, let me say this. Archival evidence shows that the only party that favored a negotiated settlement was Rajaji's Swatantra Party. The Jansangh was against a negotiated settlement. The socialists were against a negotiated settlement. The communists were an important force. But, it was obvious that they were going to support Krishna Menon. But most importantly, the Congress party, the cabinet was internally divided. And the only person who might have supported Krishna Menon in the cabinet was K.D. Malavia. And K.D. Malavia had to resign, in 1962. Nehru was instinctively in support of Krishna Menon, but Govind Vallabh Pant, of course, Pant dies in 1961, so it's only Pant's story is in 1960, and Pant plays a very important role in Chou En-lai's visit of 1960, which finally buries the door for negotiations. The window gets opened in Geneva in 1962. No, I don't think I'm contradictory. I think the fact is that neither the Congress party nor the Indian political establishment nor the Indian media by and large were in favor of a negotiated settlement. I think as Krishna Menon himself explained on more than one occasion to Michael Brecher, whom I have quoted at length, there was no forward policy because that land was seen to be India's land. It is forward policy only if you're going into somebody else's land. And Krishna Menon's argument was that this is not forward policy. These were normal posturing that we do on India's borders. But the fact is that I don't think that they expected the Chinese to attack in such full force as they did. First, on the 20th of October and subsequently on the 16th of November. The Chinese attack was a complete surprise, and the Chinese withdrawal was an even greater surprise because the Chinese attacked with great surprise and they withdrew with unilaterally as well. Sorry? Yes, including Tawang. They withdrew from Tawang, which has now become the bone of contention in the border, which was not the bone of contention in 1962, but today Tawang has become a very important element of the border dispute. But the Chinese occupied Tawang in 1962, stayed there for a couple of days, I think 8 days, and withdrew lock, stock and barrel. No, I don't think it's contradictory. I think that the fact is that there were internal political factors. Roderick MacFarquhar has written about this 3-volume history of what happened in the Cultural Revolution and what were the domestic factors that were pushing Mao. Krishna Menon himself, on 2 or 3 occasions, has expressed great surprise that his friend, as he called him, Chou En-lai, could have actually supported this invasion. I think till the end, Krishna Menon believed that this was a decision of Mao, and this was not a decision which Chou En-lai fully and enthusiastically participated. So the 62 is an exceedingly complex issue. It's not as simple. The forward policy thesis of Neville Maxwell, I think, has been debunked by foreign scholars. It's been debunked by Indian scholars, and that doesn't hold true anymore. But the important thing is that the border has to be settled through negotiations. That is a principle that has now been accepted both by India as well as by China. How long these negotiations will take place, nobody knows. Because after all, when Nixon went to Shanghai, and you know the story better than most of us, when Nixon goes to Shanghai in February 1972, he's making small talk, and he asks Chou En-lai, well, Excellency, what do you think of the French Revolution? And Chou En-lai says, too soon to tell.
This is to Jairamji. This is a quick... Jairamji, this is a quick comment and a question. First thing is, Mr. Gandhi had talked about you writing a book, being out of par. You writing a book being out of par. I think being a congressman and writing about somebody even after 50 years, half a century, about somebody who's been cast away by the Congress party requires a lot of conviction. I think Emma Matai probably should be added in the meningitis list. But the important question is, Menon started off his career as a representative to, he was a borough councillor, he was in London, and then as a representative to the United Nations and, London. Would he have been a better foreign minister? Would history, the course of history would have been different, or would history be kind to him? More kind to him if he had been a foreign minister, which he was more suited for.
See, I don't indulge in retrospective angst in this book. And I don't look at counterfactuals, what might have happened. But since you have raised this question, let me answer it. Menon had a multifarious character. He was a founder of Pelican Books. He had a very important, I'm so glad that Penguin has published this book, because Penguin was his creation. Pelican was his creation. He was a borough councillor, as you say, for 14 years. He was a borough councillor. Would India have been better off with Krishna Menon as foreign minister? Yes. Would India have been better off with him as education minister? Yes, with the benefit of hindsight. But if you look at the defense record, defense production, I've given you examples. It was Menon. DRDO, the creation of DRDO. When Kalam was president, they brought out a book on the creation of DRDO. And the first chapter was how DRDO was created. And it was Krishna Menon who was responsible for the creation of DRDO. So even within defense, it is 1962, which colors our perception of the man. But if you were to push me to a corner and say, answer my question, hold a pistol in my head, I'd say, yeah, I think it'd be better off if he was a foreign minister. But Nehru did not believe that anybody else other than him was going to be a good foreign minister. In fact, there's a wonderful story that Gopal will probably recall, that Nehru wanted Rajaji in his cabinet. And he told Patel that I want, CR in my cabinet. And Patel was very wily, very, very clever. He knew exactly, what Nehru was strengths and what his weaknesses. So he says, yeah, Jawaharlal, why don't you offer him external affairs? And that was the last that was heard of Rajaji's.
Hello, sir. Good evening. My question is, it was because of Nehru being an idealist, India was not able to foresee the Chinese war. And Indira Gandhi being a realist, pragmatic approach, India has won in the 1971 war. What my question is there a place for idealistic leader in the current world politics?
I think the best answer to this question was provided by Gopal's former boss, R. Venkatraman, who was defense minister, whom I have quoted. And Venkatraman said that Krishna Menon laid the foundations for our success in 65 and 71. And don't judge him by what happened in 62, because a lot of the decisions that he took paid dividends in 65. And this is not me speaking, this is R. Venkatraman speaking as a former defense minister. He wrote about this when he was president. So, yes, both of them were idealist. Both of them believed that a negotiated settlement, Krishna Menon far more so than Nehru. Nehru, remember, after 58, it's the autumn of the patriarch. 58 onwards, Nehru is slow decline and political influence. It's very important, Indians forget. In 1958, India had a very severe foreign exchange crisis. The same type of crisis that India had in 91, India had in 58. And after 1958, the Western powers began to dictate terms to India far more than they were able to dictate from 47 to 58. The India Consortium is formed. India's dependence on the World Bank increases. India's dependence on America increases for PL 480 food, particularly. So, post 1958, Nehru's political position is beginning to weaken, and he's beginning to be far more beholden to the right wing in his cabinet, of which Pant is the high priest. And the left wing, represented by Krishna Menon, is in retreat. So Nehru is in no position in 1960 when Chow En-lai comes to India. He is in no position to say, Krishna Menon will be with me in my talks with Chow En-lai. It is Swaran Singh who sits with Krishna Menon, with Nehru, and Chow En-lai goes to meet Krishna Menon privately. They meet each other twice. In fact, it's extraordinary. The one leader who meets Chow En-lai the maximum for the 4 days that Chow En-lai is in India, other than Nehru, is Krishna Menon. But Krishna Menon's name doesn't figure in the official records at all. It's extraordinary. But because by that time, I think Nehru's position also had begun to weaken. And Parliament, very importantly, Nehru was a creature of Parliament. Nehru believed in taking Parliament along. And the general view in Parliament, Congress Party, non-Congress Party, was that the Chinese need to be taught a lesson.
Jairam, I have a question. Don't you think the bad press that Krishna Menon received and continues to receive is also because of his legendary rudeness? Everybody suffered from his tongue, and even somebody like MC Chagla, such a mild personality, has got nothing but negative comments to make about Krishna Menon. You know, the whole thing about the housing and all that. But don't you think it was such a peculiar trait of the man that he appears to have rubbed everybody the wrong way? What do you have to say about that?
Well, one thing I'll say that Krishna Menon has created many myths and many people. He's one figure who has led to the invention of many stories centered on him. Not all of which are true, by the way. All that Khushwant Singh writes about Krishna Menon is bogus. All that M.O. Mathai has written about him is bogus. Of course, all that M.O. Mathai has written about anybody is bogus. But Krishna Menon particularly, as a fellow Malayali, he was particularly vicious, and it is bogus. Chagla, yes. I mean, there are people, who have been at the receiving end. Krishna Menon was an equal opportunity offense giver. He did not differentiate. He converted friends into enemies. He was very, very acerbic in his tongue, very acerbic in his writing. He treated Timaya, Thorat, all these army generals. He treated them with disdain. He did not follow hierarchy and systems, which are the hallmark of any army. Yes, he was rude. He was no doubt about it that he was a rude man, and sometimes his rudeness was justified, particularly when he was standing up to the Americans and the Britishers in the United Nations. His rudeness was justified, but for many occasions his rudeness was unjustified. I do not disagree with you one bit that he could have been far nicer in his dealings with people. For a diplomat, he was notoriously undiplomatic, and for a politician, he was not a networker at all. The only network he understood was Jawaharlal Nehru and Indira Gandhi. That was his only network. He even went to the extent of antagonizing Vijayalakshmi Pandit. So he didn't care for Vijayalakshmi Pandit, but he knew that he had to keep Indira Gandhi and Nehru on his side. And he was part of Nehru's family, till Nehru died. After Nehru's death, of course, Indira Gandhi treats him with respect personally, but politically, she keeps her distance. And he makes it clear to her what he thinks of her political policies. On the 18th of May 1974, you may recall, India had its first nuclear explosion at Pokhran. Krishna Menon is in Govind Vallabh Pant Hospital with only 5 months to live. And he calls Indira Gandhi and gives her a 2-hour lecture on why India going nuclear is a recipe for disaster. And what a great disservice she has done to India by taking the decision that she has taken. And he dies on the 6th of October. He calls her again to hospital on the 2nd of October. Shah of Iran is coming to India, and he tells Indira Gandhi about the importance of Iran in India's geopolitical strategy. So she's maintaining that relationship. She used to go and call on him in the hospital very frequently. She maintained an extraordinary, he called her Hindu, she called him Krishna, although 21 years separated them. But politically, she kept him at a distance. She found him too much of a hot potato. In fact, the book starts by quoting her. She described him as a volcano. Although she described him as a volcano which has now become extinct. But the fact is that she described him as a volcano.
My question is on the issue of dissonance that you're talking in today's politics as compared to what it was earlier. It's become more acerbic, more contradictory, and not good for democracy. My question first to you is, why do you think it has become like this?
Why do you think it's happened?
It's like this.
Well, it's very easy to say that, the Nehruvian era has passed, and even Mr. Vajpayee in many ways represented the values of the Nehruvian era. He grew up in the Nehruvian era, which was an era of discussion, debate, parliamentary give and take. And I think that's one explanation. But politics has become far more personalized, we are debating people, we are attacking people, not necessarily attacking each other's ideas, attacking each other's positions. And it's become far more personalized and certainly far more vicious than it was during that time. But the political debates then were very, very sharp, intense criticism. And I think if you read the debates, I was surprised. I myself was surprised the extent to which Nehru gets criticized in Parliament and in meetings of the Congress Parliamentary Party by own congressmen. And that whole entire debate was different, and I think the atmosphere was different. And today, in parliamentary debates hardly ever take place. But Prime Minister, of course, never comes to Parliament. He comes only to reply to the motion of thanks of the President. He never comes to Parliament, never sits in Parliament. Mr. Vajpayee used to come very regularly, and Dr. Manmohan Singh used to sit very regularly. Nehru, of course, was legendary. He would just... Indira Gandhi was not a regular Parliament goer. But Nehru was, for 17 years, he would diligently, scrupulously sit in Parliament. When he died, one of the best tributes to him, of course, was by Mr. Vajpayee. But another person who made one of his moving tributes was Acharya N.G. Ranga, who was a bitter critic of Nehru, criticized him for the cooperative farming resolution and many other economic policies. And Ranga got up and said, the fact that my speech today is going into the parliamentary records is because of the dear departed Prime Minister who helped the tree of democracy to grow. So I think, the type of care that our institutions, democratic institutions, require, that has disappeared. And that starts at the very top. The signal has to come from the very top.
Season's greetings to everybody. Mr. Jairam Ramesh, what is whether the Congress continues to have relationship with the Labour Party at the moment? Because whenever we go to the Labour Party meetings, Neil Kinnock, the former leader, used to talk about his friendship with Jawaharlal Nehru.
Mike.
Yeah, whether the party continues to have relationship with the Labour Party at the moment.
Labour Party. Oh.
Because whenever we go to the Congress Labour meetings, Neil Kinnock used to invite us as Indian doctors when we go there.
I think we have moved far away from the Labour Party. In fact, we used to have Congress Party sessions where fraternal delegates would come from Cuba, would come from Palestine, would come from certainly from the Labour Party.
South Africa.
No, that era is over. And I think the Labour Party also has become more inward looking, as the Congress Party has become more inward looking. That era was there in the 40s and in the early part of the 50s. Certainly in the late 40s, at the time when negotiations were taking place for the transfer of power and for what became independence and partition of India.
Is there any particular
well, you know, this is an extraordinary photograph because it shows him smiling. It shows him smiling not in an arrogant way. It shows him smiling in a very human way. This is a photograph. He's smiling at Dag Hammarskjöld, who was his constant sparring partner in the United Nations. They hated each other with a passion, but he was smiling at him. And you know, the cover designer said he doesn't look Mephistophelian, which he normally looks. He looks human. He looks good, and that's how this photograph was chosen. Some people have remarked on the color of the cover, whether the color of the cover reflects his ideological predilections. I don't think that had anything to do with it, because I don't think, frankly, Krishna Menon was a communist. Krishna Menon made use of the British Communist Party because the British Communist Party was the first and only political party in England to support full independence for India. And that's why Henry Pollitt, Ben Bradley, Rajni Palme Dutt were very close to Krishna Menon. In fact, the Scotland Yard report on Krishna Menon says he's very close to the communists, but he can never be a communist because he lacks the discipline to be a communist.
So Jairam, I think to take off from V. Sriram's point about Krishna Menon's proverbial or legendary arrogance, what would be the most arrogant thing that Krishna Menon will tell you about your book, and what will be your answer?
Puts you on a spot. There are so many things about Krishna Menon. I think, frankly, Krishna Menon would have loved this book. No man would maintain records for 50 years and not hope that some literary archaeologist will come and excavate that archive. I think Nehru had a sense of history. I think Gandhi had a great sense of history. They maintained every little scrap of paper. They knew at some stage these scraps of paper would have historical importance. And Krishna Menon was part of that generation. So I refuse to believe that he would not have liked this biography. He did not collaborate with the first biography that was written of him by T.J.S. George. He was very, very unhappy that that biography was written. But, Michael Brescher, he collaborated with in 1968. He did not write an autobiography. He did not write any memoir, never left behind even an unpublished memoir. So I think he would have been happy that this biography was written, and that the man, in all his many colors, many positive colors and many negative colors, a remarkable propensity to commit suicide and not carry out that threat, a remarkable propensity to write resignation letters and not send the resignation letters, a remarkable propensity to imagine slights and persecution, almost paranoid. He's a psychologist's delight. If there's a psychohistorian in this audience or anybody wanting to psychoanalyze a personality, Krishna Menon is a fit case for a psychohistory. The relationship that he had with Nehru, people, would ascribe it to all sorts of, psychological terms and psychological sentiments on the part of both. But I think he would, I think of trying to say what nasty crack he would make. And so you found the time to write it. How did the Congress Party allow you to write it? Maybe perhaps that would have been the question that he would have asked. And I would have responded that the Congress Party is still a broad enough umbrella to accommodate different points of view. And I think, a genuine attempt I have made at writing contemporary history dispassionately. It's just, you have to be dispassionate about people. You have to stand back when you're writing contemporary history and look at events in a very cold-blooded manner, whether it's 1962 or whether it's, subsequent events that happened later on. I think we need more. The trouble with history writing in India, you either have left-wing historians or you have right-wing historians. You don't have historians who write history. Now, what is the word for history in most Indian languages? The word for history in most Indian languages is itihas. Itihasa. Thus it was. So history means thus it was, not thus what you imagine it was. I think both sides have taken positions, and the net casualty has been scholarship. I think scholarship is what we have to revive in the writing of Indian history. Whether it's right-wing or left-wing, I don't care, as long as there is scholarship. Gopal, I've just read a fascinating biography of Sir Jadunath Sarkar. Now, Sir Jadunath Sarkar is, in my view, perhaps the most scholarly Indian historian that there ever has been. Scholarly. What I mean is the man who would go into archives. And Jadunath Sarkar believed that he was a citizen, not of the Republic of India, which he was, but of the Republic of Letters. There's a very nice phrase in one of his notes. He says, "I'm a citizen of the Republic of Letters." And Jadunath Sarkar was the man who wrote 5 volumes on the life of Aurangzeb. And all that we know about Aurangzeb is part derived from Jadunath Sarkar. He is reviled by the left-wing historians as a man who has demonized Aurangzeb. But he's also a man who has criticized Shivaji. And the Maharashtrians and the Marathas were anti-Sarkar because he was critical of Shivaji. But Jadunath Sarkar, to the great tragedy of this country, one historian, no stamp was released in his honor, got no Padma Shri, no Padma Bhushan, no Padma Vibhushan. All of the historians did. Because in the post-independent era, he began to symbolize a writing of history which seemed to accentuate the communal sentiments. But what Jadunath Sarkar was doing was being faithful to the written word. Persian archives, Marathi archives, English archives, he was going by what is there in the archives. And I think, although Jadunath Sarkar is the great apostle of today's right-wingers, I would say, to my mind, he represents historical scholarship, which we need to rescue from either left-wing ideologies or right-wing ideologies.
So, Jairam, I think your Padma Shri is in great danger.
Thank you. My Krishna Menon response to your crack on Padma Shri is, why only Padma Shri?